Everyone's well aware that our country is going through some serious tribulation economically. The whole world, in fact, is dealing with serious economic troubles. There are signs of hope in many areas of our economy. I think it's important for us, particularly those of us in elected office, to recognize those good things, and that the strength of the American people will certainly pull us out of this hole, as they have many times in the future. Hopefully what we do here in Washington will help and not hurt. I think everyone's aware that a large part of our recession is the banking and credit problem. Certainly, if it didn't cause it, it made it much worse and continues to today. Unfortunately, the new administration, the Congress, has not put forth any plan to fix our credit crisis, to make our banks work appropriately, while many of them are and call me to remind me that they are loaning money. They are working, but there's still a lot we need to do in the credit area that we haven't fixed. Unfortunately, the $1 trillion so-called stimulus plan that we passed only a couple of weeks ago, all borrowed money, didn't address the credit banking problem. It addressed issues that had nothing to do with the recession. The stimulus provided a lot of additional funds for education, health care, and infrastructure. A lot of good things. Those things didn't cause our recession, and they're certainly not going to get us out of it. I think the failure to bring forth a plan that addresses the real causes of the recession, I think, has many people around the country wondering what we're thinking. Fact is, what we're thinking is about the next election and not the next generation. It's become clear we're not addressing the real causes of problems, but are doing things that are more politically beneficial than really beneficial to our economy. You know, as we deal with the difficult economic situation, it's almost hard to see the White House going in a lot of different directions, and some that are especially painful, particularly the issue of life. The new president campaigned on reducing the number of abortions, but in the first month, 6 weeks of his presidency, he has changed the rule where now the American taxpayer is funding abortions all around the world. They've put forth an executive order to strike the conscience clause, which means we're going to require physicians who are opposed to abortion to perform abortion. That makes no sense at all. When there are physicians who make a living performing abortions, why should we take a physician who considers it the taking of a life and force him to do it? Why do we need to do that in the middle of a recession and the economic problems that we've got? And today the president reversed a prohibition on federal funding of certain types of stem cells. Seems to be opening up Pandora's box to begin the destruction of unborn human beings. And his cabinet nominee for Health and Human Services has been one of the most radical pro-abortion folks in the country, have encouraged and protected late-term abortion, partial birth abortions, things that even many people who are not pro-life think we certainly should not be performing late-term abortions in this country. Yet the president seems to be going in a rather radical direction, and that in the middle of this economic storm that we have. We've got to wonder, you know, what are they thinking? And today we come to this, what we're calling an omnibus spending bill, only 2 weeks after we passed this huge spending bill we called a stimulus, $1 trillion or if you add interest. And 2 weeks later, we're talking about a bill that's over $400 billion. The federal agencies cannot even spend the money as fast as we're throwing at them. But now we're here today with this other bill under the pretense that we've got to have this money to make the country operate. Americans need to know that we've been operating under this year's funding through what we call a continuing resolution, which means we're operating essentially at last year's budget. and the country's been operating effectively. The reason we're passing this bill is not that we need it to fund the government, because the government is funded under a continuing resolution, which we could extend through the end of the year. We actually need to be about working on next year's budget and next year's appropriation. That's what we're supposed to be doing now. Instead, we're going back and creating this new spending bill, which I consider an ominous spending bill, not so much an omnibus. Now, what I have in front of me right here is the reason that there's such a rush to pass this additional spending bill. All Americans have heard of earmarks. These are the earmarks in this spending bill. And this is the reason that it has to be passed. If you remember last week, they brought it up and said we had to pass it before Friday, or the government would shut down and it would just not be right to pass another continuing resolution. Well, come Thursday, they found out because the American people had gotten agitated and outraged and had begun to call and email their senators that they didn't quite have the votes to pass this bill last week. But they'll pass it because they've taken over 9,000 earmarks, special projects, and sprinkled them all around to Republicans and Democrats here in the House and the Senate. It's hard to vote against a bill that has a special project in it. But some Americans have begun to hear a little bit about these earmarks. And I'll just take the one that's sitting right here on the top of this stack. Keep in mind that we're over 9,000 earmarks for most of the congressmen and senators. Now, a lot of senators will come out here today and talk about it's wasteful, we shouldn't cut the earmarks, but they'll vote for it because a lot of them have already done the press releases on the money that they're taking back home. But I'll just read a couple here on the front page. We've got, you know, there's an amount column, a project column, a purpose, a location. Then they have the names of the congressmen and senators, but they've struck those out. I'm not exactly sure why, but the first amount is $200,000 to Providence Holy Cross Foundation, and it's for tattoo removal, violence prevention outreach program in Mission Hills, California. Now, I'm sure that that's a worthy cause, but in the middle of a recession, when we're borrowing trillions of dollars to try to keep this country going, and the President is saying we have to make every dollar count, and he's going to strike every item of waste, what is the federal government doing funding the removal of tattoos? The second item is $75,000. That's not too bad, although it's more than most families make in a whole year. It's for the city of Albany. It's for Totally Teen Zone. Now, this is Albany, Georgia. This is where they go and play with Xboxes and things like that, and I'm sure that's a fine thing. But you've got to wonder, in these times where we're really out of money as a country, that we need to be involved as a federal government with this kind of thing. The next item is $400,000 for the University of Montana. It's for teacher training, curriculum development, and awareness initiatives to combat bullying, as well as the development of emergency protocol for school shootings. Something I'm sure that's very necessary to combat bullying in schools. It's certainly something every school has to deal with. But how can we as a federal government send $400,000 to one university and expect to solve problems all over the country? Well, the next one is $50,000 for Los Angeles after dark gang prevention. Again, all good things. But there's probably no senator that's read all of these, but they know the ones that are in it for them, because that's why they're going to be voting for the bill. And the tacit agreement always is that we're going to get the votes to pass this bill so that these 9,000 earmarks, these 9,000 press releases, will go out all over the country. Our only hope of stopping this is if the American people continue to show their outrage and to continue to connect the dots of what we're doing here. Because we're not doing this to fund the government. This isn't about last year's business. But it violates every pledge that many people here have run on, and certainly the President. If you recall, the President has said he was against earmarks. When I introduced a moratorium, a one-year moratorium on earmarks, he flew back along with all the candidates for president, or at least the top three at that time, to vote to have a one-year moratorium on earmarks, because more and more are seeing the damage this is doing to our country. You can pass almost any bill with any bad policy, with almost any level of spending, as long as you fill it with earmarks for people back home. They're thinking about the next election, not the next generation. They're not thinking about the families who are hurting because they're losing their jobs right now, because this is much more likely to cause additional job losses over the next 5 to 10 years than it is to help create them. So this is the seed. This greases the skids to pass almost any type of bill. If you remember, when the first Wall Street bailout came through the House, it failed. And so when the Senate took it up, what did they add to it to help it get passed? More earmarks. Now, we've had several amendments to strike some of these earmarks, and there have been some heroes on the issue. John McCain has certainly been out on the floor talking about the problems with earmarks that he's seen over the many years that he's been here in the Senate. And he has one other amendment that will be on the floor that will basically take all of these earmarks. They aren't in the legislation. They're in what they call report language off to the side, so it's not seen in the bill that's on the desk right here. But there's a reference in here to this, and that supposedly makes it all legal. The Constitution says we have to appropriate money based on law, which means it has to be in the bill. But we do everything we can to get around that Constitution and law by attaching some rider in here that says all of these should be considered as law. Folks, this is no way to run a federal government. This is just one bill. It has nothing to do with the trillions of dollars of Wall Street and banking bailout we've been talking about, or the $1 trillion stimulus 2 weeks ago. Over $400 billion with over 9,000 earmarks they wanted to rush through last week. But because of people back home, some were shamed into saying they couldn't vote for it unless we had a longer process with more amendments. Now, this is show that there's already a strategy to kill every amendment that comes up. So we're really not trying to pass an amendment to strip earmarks. And you'll see Senator McCain's good amendment that'll be added, a common sense amendment that let's, in the middle of our financial crisis, let's take these and set them aside and just pass the bill that funds our government. It's a good amendment, but the decision has already been made on the other side to kill that amendment unless the American people can shame a few more into voting against it. You know, John Ensign has an amendment that will strike some language in the bill that seeks to discontinue school choice in Washington, D.C. It's a small program, only 1,700 kids are involved with it, but there's a waiting list of parents who would like another choice. And it's in this funding bill, this must-have funding bill, they sneak in a little policy like that to kill a little bit of freedom in our country that we need to be expanding to every state, not killing it in Washington, D.C. David Vitter has an amendment that will force Congress to vote on pay raises for congressmen and senators every year instead of what we do right now is just there's an automatic provision in the appropriation bills that just go through and give us a cost of living pay raise. This should be done in the light of day. Right now we can say we didn't vote on a pay raise, and we didn't, because it was set up years ago just to be automatic. But in a time when many Americans don't have work, some are taking pay cuts just to keep their job, Senator Vitter's idea to be more transparent in what we do here in Washington makes a lot of sense. The President has promised change. Our growing concern is that the biggest change so far in Washington has been in him. We want to support him as much as we can, but he did say that he would stop this practice of earmarking. But he's looking the other way on this bill. He's saying he supports it. He could veto this bill and send it back to Congress and tell us to get rid of these earmarks. He could keep his promise, and he could force us to change. But right now, this stack of earmarks is so addictive that the congressmen and senators who have these projects that they're so proud of back home are not going to vote against a bill. You could double this bill to $800 billion, and I'm pretty sure it would pass anyway as long as it had these earmarks in it. Folks, as Senator Coburn from Oklahoma says, that earmarks are the gateway drug to this runaway spending that we have in Washington. We're spending our children and grandchildren into such a hole that it's going to be almost impossible for them to get out. We're almost guaranteeing them a lower quality of life than we've had. As we borrow more and more money from other countries, we print more and more money, and we spend more money as a government than we ever thought possible. This is the time we need to stop this runaway spending. An amendment will be on the floor to strike these earmarks and to continue to fund the government through the rest of the year. The other side doesn't want any amendments passed because that would mean we'd have to go back and work with the House on a final bill. They want it to go through amendment-free. It's up to us to make sure that the American people know what's in this bill before we vote it. And that's the whole point of extending the debate. My hope is we'll have 2 or 3 days to make the American people more aware of what's really in it, and even more importantly, what's in this stack of earmarks that is the reason this bill is being rushed through the Senate.